Hey everybody, this is Petey from the Spin Rack, and we also have
Calvin Ellis, ready to rock.
today we're doing a video, just a commentary or reaction to Rob Liefeld's podcast, Robservations. I've done one of these before where I had to hash out the actual be not just a rivalry between Byrne and Perez, because the two of them, yes, were rivals, but at the same time they weren't. Perez wasn't going to DC to get away from Byrne to get it, like he wanted to do both companies, and he decided on the Titans. And the DC got royalties before Marvel did, but Marvel didn't. Byrne didn't go in there. I need to go over there. He didn't go over there back in 1982. He stayed with Marvel. So it's like this idea of it's fun because at the same time, like I would argue differences between artists with my brother, where he liked Neil Adams, Dave Cockrum, a bunch of Bill Sienkiewicz, and all of those he would say were better than Byrne, and I would have to read Byrne interviews where Byrne would compliment them. It's like, oh, I can't fight him on these ones because I didn't realize that Byrne was a Neil Adams clone. He was a big fan of Dave Cockrum, and of course he would adhere to Bill Sienkiewicz as an artist, being closer to Neil. So then those are his peers. So anyway, basically he has this podcast where he decided to do a beef between Todd McFarlane and John Byrne. Now this was this is in the comic press type of beef because they were on panels together. So it was not like that. And Byrne would come off of the panel saying, oh, Todd said that, hey, Jack Kirby did knees incorrectly. And, it's right because he was consistent in that incorrection. And Byrne was like, is he right? And he did a blog on it, which was just fun, but it would probably, in Rob's eyes, looked at, he's tearing them down. But before I keep going on forever, let's drag in Cal and say his first words. What are your thoughts so far?
I've said this before. When it's an observation by Rob Liefeld, it can be pretty spot on. When it's a Robservation, we don't know how deep the rabbit hole goes.
Yeah, it's so in this thing he decided to do Byrne versus Todd McFarlane, as I said, and ultimately there's a feeling from Rob's side that Byrne, looking at his peers taking making tons of money on New Mutants and Young Blood, and X-Force and Young Blood and Prophet, and making these deals with Hollywood, and them doing all this stuff to kind of build back they didn't build it, but they kind of, when in the 70s comics, the comics creators say it was going to be gone, kind of, putting their work in there. Feels like, that they were jealous of them. Using Byrne as the fourth, the person in the forefront, but obviously there were other people like Byrne, and they would go second, which would be Peter David. Even though Perez was close to them, he did comment on them. What's that thing? Swiping, and he also was, Rob would say Perez was kind of, the fix was in as mediating the Todd McFarlane and who's that guy, and Peter David debate. So there was something, but he's using Byrne as a spearhead of as a man up front in this beef against the Image guys. When I will give just my basic thing of, Byrne being the success he was, he had done Alpha Flight, which sold, at least the first one sold as much as as much as the X-Men. And then sales it was a top 10 book, but it wasn't that sort of number. So Byrne kind of looked at that like saying, maybe the fans are kind of not cool with what happened with how I'm writing this. So maybe Bill Mantlo does it. But then when he went to Superman, that went to 1 million, and then the numbers went down. So he started looking at it as a speculator thing, that the people will buy a number one from someone who's hot, and then they won't support the book afterwards, or they'll be decent sales, but it wouldn't be readers. And that would be kind of weigh on him that they're not actual readers. So when Rob and Jim Lee and Todd were making a lot of money and Marvel was profiting off of that, Byrne had started to speak out against going to the speculators. and he was complimenting Todd, and he was like saying, "Hey." And then Byrne got the X Men. He got to write the X Men for maybe it wasn't for a short time because the schedule was so bad. He complained, and then they pushed him out. But he was on X Men after X Men #1, which is like millions in sales type of deal. But he was still saying, "Hey, this Spider Man #1, X Men #1, this stuff is too crazy," and it's like you don't want to push this far, especially with the number of comic readers. But Rob kind of looks at it still as jealousy, and that every time Byrne comments on it, that he is just jealous of them. It's not, he hates that their success and what they kind of took away because they were saying, "Hey, Byrne went that back to Marvel, and he only got what was it? He only got West Coast Avengers and She-Hulk, even though She-Hulk was a top 10 book. West Coast Avengers had bumped up in sales, and then he also had Wolverine. He wrote Wolverine. He only wrote, he drew Wolverine only to work with Archie Goodwin. And when Archie Goodwin left, he wasn't really killing himself about the sales. He was like, well, Archie's gone, so I'm gonna exit also. It wasn't like, hey, I got this book with all these royalties. I'm here, I'm gonna stay forever type of deal. And he also got the writing title. So he wasn't, being a established pro and having people like Frank Miller, Walter Simonson, Perez, all these guys in the fan press beat him out, and he'd be like the number 2 or 3 artist. He'd been used to people knocking him off the top spot. It'd been happening all throughout his career. So, but I've said a lot. Let's drag you in there again, Cal.
Well, as usual, it starts off with a certain Rob starts off with a certain premise, and I wait for that premise to actually come, and it doesn't.
Yes, the actual beef between Todd and Weston. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, but he does this wind up, and because at one point I was talking with you before the show about it, where he's talking about, yeah, my son, he led the school to 2 championships, but the other guys want their sons to play too, and even though he had won 2 championships, I'm like, what is this, like middle school football? It's like, yeah, they want their sons to play. It's like, your son's he doesn't have a contract. They want the kids to play. Okay, yeah, and the thing is that in that moment too, it's for me, it's a little bit of a revelation with, well, I think Rob Liefeld is who he is, but he's saying that his son won 2 championships, and you can hear him intimating he should stay. And I'm like, but he won 2 championships. Let somebody else have a turn.
Mm-hmm.
They only get this shot. And this is something he has to understand. When, be it sports or comic books or those things in life like music that can be really fleeting, a lot of times the shot that you have is the shot that you have. That's it. you know so everybody wants to get a chance at that brass ring on the carousel, rather than just, well, no, I'm gonna hog this, and I'm gonna keep the whole thing and justify it by winning by winning at the end of the day, these particular trophies that are not going to really amount to much at the end of the day, other than great memories for me and a whole bunch of you guys looking sour when we take the team picture. So we get to the whole situation with the comics. Uh, I mean, for me, arguably the first comic book superstar is Jerry Siegel, because this is the first person who did anything with a comic book that people even paid attention to. Jerry Siegel was the guy who he did a whole bunch of interviews regarding Superman, had his picture in the paper. Mind you, Jerry Siegel, not Joe Shuster, but Jerry Siegel.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
this was, yeah. So for me, the whole idea of these guys coming later, I'm like, oh, right. Well, this is where I think the history does start, because you have Superman and then you have Jerry Siegel. And it wasn't that people just tapped Superman. No, they actually wanted to know about the creator. He did multiple interviews. And again, your stardom fades, like he says, your stardom fades. Superman still goes on, but then of course Jerry Siegel becomes harder for. Most people have no idea who the hell Jerry Siegel is, but at the time, Jerry Siegel was popular because of the work that he was doing on Superman, on that particular comic. The stuff with Neil Adams is harder for me to put my finger on, but he goes in and he does say some stuff. I wish I had a chance to read the article that he was quoting Byrne from. But the whole idea of what makes a rebel and so on and so forth, and Byrne usually is pretty sharp. So if the idea that he wouldn't think that Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster where these rebels at the end of the day would be a bit surprising because they were trying to sell super. It wasn't that they followed a trend; they had been trying to sell Superman for 5 years before they got it on, and they were trying to do a new strip, not a comic book. Okay, it fell into the comic book first, and they still were hot for that new strip even after the comic book because that would have been more prestigious at the end of the day. But in the same, but then to look at the image guys and say, well, no, they weren't taking a risk because of the money, and like, well, yeah,
Well, let's go
it's a
before.
totally different. It's a totally different thing. I thought for the image guys. Go ahead.
Let's stick with the Superman, the Joe Schuster, the Jerry Siegel and Joe Schuster. You made a good point, and that was a strong point that Rob did. This is his podcast that he has. You can get it on Apple or look online. I think obviously now it looks like he hasn't been updating it, so you get it on through the website. But I agreed when I was listening to it. It's like, yes, that's a strong argument that they were rebels. They did something that, even if there were elements that were stuff, I guess, like Doc Savage and like that sort of thing, and sci-fi elements that were like they were putting together, that sort of package, whether it was done in different ways before, this type of thing, and them getting shot down so many times, and even, I think you've said it many times that DC or National deciding to publish it just because they needed something to fill it up, but they put it in the number one spot because it's the flashiest thing they got, and it was the most
Yeah.
successful. And I would give that in. So I don't know if Rob made him the superstar, but I would go what you said, because you have him going the same thing that Byrne went through, because he goes and he speaks when they're speaking engagement. They have Jerry Siegel there. Sometimes it's Joe Schuster with him, but it's mostly Jerry Siegel speaking. He's very much just in the same instance of Byrne doing it. Now, I think Rob was kind of trying to say, hey, they were called, like the Today Show wasn't calling Byrne because he's Byrne. They were calling him because he was the official on Superman, and he was, at least could kind of, he was the same way Jerry Siegel was, just coming there. Don't say anything that blows anything up. Just be, gracious
Well,
and
it, it's Superman's 50th birthday.
yes.
They're going to follow the direct line. Superman's 50th birthday. Well, who's writing the book right now? Him? Okay, get him on the show.
That's the line. And when he talked about, hey, Byrne had time, no, that was also Superman. And they say, hey, go to, they're the same time as the same company as the comic, as DC's under Warner Brothers. They're like, they let they let the comics do the cover. So it wasn't like, yes, to his peers, none of his peers before or after got Time magazine, but there was more connect. It wasn't because of his superstar status. It was because of Superman. Because of that. Yes, the sales of the comic, whether it be, like you can see them getting back to the $1 million sales and the speculators, because he would obviously, I think you pointed out when we were talking that is the first variant cover. So
Mhm.
so that's also played into it. You can see that play with X-Men #1 and Spider-Man #1, that sort of thing. So kind of that's where the comic things were going. So there's factors it getting to 1 million, and DC also doing a lot of other things with those Man of Steel issues, because they had reprints, but they also had comic book, like
Oh, there was
binding
a
comics together that they would sell. They
there
would
was a
sell that somewhat different
ton
ways.
of
It's
them.
crazy. It was,
Man of Steel. Yeah, Man of Steel. I mean, I only know this because I'm a really big Superman collector. But you had Man of Steel #1, the regular cover. Then you had Man of Steel the variant, which is with the S shield there. And then you had like these other reprints, like the So Much Fun reprint, and you could get that. There was like a reprint in Hebrew. There's a
yeah.
bunch of them. Okay, I mean, if you just want to look at one, if you just look at the direct market sales, you're going to get a number. But once you had newsstand and the other stuff, there's a ton of that book was sold at the end of the day. However, and this was something, I mean, this is something I would have to lay it to feet at Marvel. The whole idea of a first issue sells. Okay, so you put a first issue, you put an icon in a big star or something, and Marvel loved to do this because we would see this as kids. Collector's item issue, collector's item,
Yes.
this type of stuff,
Yeah.
even with their reprints, collector's item classics. These are reprints. How do we get these little suckers to get these reprints? Tell them they're collector's items. But you would come over there and you would buy these things, and that was it. But it became, all right, this is the first issue. We already know that the first issue of certain books like Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, or Amazing Fantasy 15, if you will, we know that these first issues tend to, appreciate with value because of these things hit. So why don't I pick up, one or two copies of this? I can get one copy for myself. I can have another copy to sell a little bit later on. And yes, that without a doubt is speculation. Even, for a kid who just buys two, you get 100,000 kids who buy two. Your sales are double your sales are double what they naturally should be if
Yeah.
they're buying them strictly for themselves and strictly on interest. So, and that speculation is, it took a while to reach, let's call the fever point that it would in the 90s, but it started and it was stoked. Maybe not as much as it was in the 90s, but I mean, come on. I can tell you how many kids picked up Alpha Flight, GI Joe, Superman, any
Mhm.
of those other books that came out around those times that are escaping me right now. But this was the first issue. You got in from the ground up, and even with the whole thing with collecting, what collecting used to be is you just kept them someplace and you could, get to them. Then it became, well, you got to have the polyurethane bag and the
Yeah.
backing board and put them in a proper box. All of that, that right over there, that preservation, okay, that preservation is with the intent to do what? If one day these things hit, I'm selling them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, the stuff
Yeah.
that I want for myself is cool, but I need to make certain that these are kept in proper condition. Why? Hey, because one day I may actually want to sell it. Otherwise, there's no reason to do any of that. Like, there's really no reason to do it. It's the same reason why you have a bookshelf and don't throw the book to the side. No, this needs to be stored in a proper manner, be kept so I can retrieve it, look at it. Oh, and perhaps one day if I decide to sell it, it's still in good condition. We get to by the time you get to the 90s, uh, uh, speculating on a book like Alpha Flight, okay, I think is reasonable. You have a team, it was a cool looking team. You have John Byrne on the book, Marvel book too, reasonable speculation at the end of the day. And most of us didn't understand that, hey, this book is selling 600,000 copies. This book is rare. This book is rare as snow at the North Pole. We're never, going to make any money on this book. But you
Yeah.
still went for it. It's the first, you still went for it. It's the first issue. I mean, and the irony is that, you look at something like Spawn, and Spawn, the first issue of Spawn sold more copies than Alpha Flight did. It did better than double the numbers of Alpha Flight, and you can get more money for a copy of Spawn than you can for a copy of Alpha Flight these days. So a lot of stuff is just counterintuitive, but that's where you get the whole spec coming from. And Burns' biggest criticism to what I recall and what I remember reading was not the image dudes, but the fact that, hey, no, you guys are targeting these dudes here who are buying multiple copies of this book, really inflating these sales. And we don't, the comic industry doesn't have this many readers. There is no reason why Youngblood out the gate, and Rob Liefeld can be as proud of it as he likes. But the fact remains, there were never 1 million Youngblood readers. They
Yes.
weren't. It just wasn't. That's one of the reasons. And then when you look back, you're like, oh, they were jealous, and everybody puts it at our feet. Nobody puts it at your feet for the jealousy, and maybe unfairly, but people look at you guys for causing the crash
Yes.
because
Yeah.
because you guys inflated these books. These guys were speculating hard. Okay,
Mhm.
and Marvel and DC, they fell in line with the covers, and the glossy covers and so on and so forth. They fell right in line with what they thought were attractive to dudes. And then the bottom drops out, just like with the Great Depression, when one guy makes a run on the bank saying, "Look, I want all my money now," and then everybody else is like, "What?" Everybody else tries to sell too, and then before you know it, they're all out. Nobody's buying. Instead of, you didn't have 3 million readers, you had like 1 million readers. So there's 2/3 of the revenue that you were making, and everything that results from there. I don't ever. And Byrne, I know Byrne can have a very acerbic wit, if you want to
Yeah.
call it
Yeah.
that. If you want to call it that, but the crux of what he was talking about is there were not enough readers, and you guys are selling to these speculators, and eventually they come for their money, and there's no money for these particular books. They didn't understand how it works. All those guys who were standing in line, buying 3-4 copies of the Death of Superman, and then thought that they were gonna get some actual money for it, and then realize no, because the store wouldn't even buy it from them, because, like, look, I got 2 boxes full of this stuff, I'm still trying to move it.
Mhm. Well, let's and going back to sticking with the rebel part, right? I'm agreeing that what's the name, Siegel and Schuster rebels and what they were doing. I'm disagreeing with Rob. Agreeing with Rob on that. I'm disagreeing with that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby weren't rebels, because the
Are
thing.
you kidding me?
You can bring up you can bring up the challenges all you want, but Simon and Kirby already had the Space Cateers. They had that format. They were doing that format of space or explorers before the Fantastic Four. The difference for the Fantastic Four is Stan and having the thing as a monster. That's the
Yes.
two things. The two big things. Yeah, you can say they're four people, this, that, and the other. The personalities and having a monster as a teammate is what made them go beyond. Even if there was Atlas Comics, and
We
Stan's
had
voice is way different than what you see before and after. Totally
Oh,
different.
forget
Yeah.
it all boils down to what Stan Lee has said in more than one interview, has been printed more than one time, that he was on some level, or on a really large level, dissatisfied with the work that he was doing, that he was thinking about leaving. One of the reasons why his byline was Stan Lee, because he wanted to write the great American novel one day and didn't
Yeah.
want to be weighed down by these comics. Like, these comics have never amount to anything. Little did he know, great ironies there. But he has a conversation with his wife, and she's like, "Why don't you write the comic the way you want to do it? Just one time, of course, because we still need the check. You know,
Yes.
why don't you write it the way that you want to write?" And he says this. Okay, he says this. It was never like, "I'm gonna come over here." Like, no, he got his marching orders from Martin Goodman. Martin Goodman says, "Look, I want you to do something just like the Justice League." You look at the cover for Fantastic Four; it's
Yes.
pretty much the same layout
Yes.
as Brave and the Bold, the first appearance of the Justice League. Okay, but and this was something I didn't tap. I only found this, really learned this years later from going back and reading some of the other stuff that Stan wrote and the things that came before. But it really was this. If you look at Fantastic Four just for the stuff that, in terms of the dialogue and the monster on the team, again, you got some stuff that definitely was not commonplace. But then all of the other additives, you had the monster aspect, which was popular. Okay, you had the hotshot teenager, which was definitely going to attract the teens at the end of the day. You had the sci-fi aspect, and then you had the monster, and you also, I'm sorry, I already said the monster. You had the romance, like the love stories aspect that Stan was also writing, and all of that was in one book.
Yes.
All of that
Yeah.
was in one
Yes.
book.
Yeah. The
A lot of guys just
multi-genre. Yeah.
yeah, a lot of guys just don't get it. Like, no, if you pre, I mean, because Stan was writing like Millie the Model and Patsy Cline and all the Love Lauren stuff and everything. That was in the book. The monster stuff, that was, and you had two monsters if you count the Torch. But the Torch was also okay. He's the hotshot. He was the most popular character for the most part. And then you still have Reed. You still have Reed coming over there, which is for me like the real grounding of it with the science fiction. Because if not for Reed, these guys would. I have no idea what science they would be doing. It would have just been, hey, let's see what trouble Johnny can get into this month.
Yeah.
But you have all of that. You have all of that going on. All of those elements and Cave, which, to be honest, was very. It's not the same as Superman, but in an interview, Siegel had said that he had decided to take every single one of these archetypical strongmen and roll them into one, and that's how you got Superman. So you were going to get some aspects of Hercules, some aspects of Atlas, Samson. You were going to get stuff like Doc Savage. You were going to get stuff like John Carter. There was some guy who wrote another book. I forget if it was I forget it was like the Destroyer or something, and they were like those type of elements. But all of these sci-fi elements, a staple of sci-fi elements was not an alien coming to our world, but us going to an alien world. That was Flash Gordon. That was John Carter. The Earth person goes to the alien world and then has those adventures. Superman reverses that, where we have the alien coming to our world. And for the first time, the alien comes to our world, and he's on our side.
Yes.
Okay, he's not somebody we need to be afraid of, like in the what was it again? The what is it? The H.G. Wells book with the Our World? No, not Our World's at War, but the Mars Invasion book with from H.G. Wells. Can't remember the title right now, unfortunately. But that was the big difference. Then you get over there and you've got Stan. He does the same thing, not with the archetypes necessarily, but
War of
those
the
particular
Worlds.
genres. Hmm?
War of the
Yeah,
Worlds.
yeah, War of the Worlds, War of the Worlds. Yeah, and then you get all that. Okay, so anybody who would say Kirby and Stan, well, yeah, that was without a doubt. I mean, it wasn't like these guys were over there on the street saying, "Hey, creators' rights." But
Yeah.
if those two aren't rebels, then I don't know. If Siegel and Schuster and Stan and Jack are not two of the two partnerships, two of the most two partnerships that strike anybody as anything other than being rebels in terms of the turn that they made. I mean, you get the first two and you get a whole new genre. Okay. And then the second two come across and we get an expansion of the genre that nobody would have thought of. And I'm not one to come over here with this nonsense where people want to talk about, oh, well, DC, started doing this. I'm like, look, these guys are making their money. They're not trying to come over here and like, oh, we want to be avant-garde. No, they're trying to make stuff, trying to keep this money. I'm not trying to come over here and have Superman start growing trees from his nostrils or look like John Jones. This guy is a cash cow at this point. I'm going to protect the bag, as people like to say. That's where we're going to go. So that criticism for me is always unfair, especially when you had them trying all these other things. There are all these other characters that would come up, all these other side characters, and they never caught.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, they never caught. It wasn't like they came out with the Martian Manhunter and everybody was like, "Oh wow, this is great! Yeah, this is some cutting edge stuff. We love this." How many weird things that people say happened in the Silver Age? And what's the one constant? Superman. Okay, you look over at Marvel, the same thing. You have all of these characters, all of these scenarios that they create, and what's the constant that you would have? Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, Avengers. So at some point the public tells you, okay, the public tells you, hey, this is where it's at. That we want new stuff. We want some avant-garde storytelling. You guys are out of ideas. You only have one idea. Yeah, but that one idea keeps selling. And so we're gonna put out 15 X-Men titles a month until you tell us, hey, this is something right over here. Yeah, this is the thing that we really want to see you expand upon. So I've always I've never accepted that criticism, because there's a big part of the business is that you do have to make money, or else you're not publishing, and you're going to publish in respect to what the people want to read and what they're going to spend money on. And if they're going to spend money on 15 X books a month, then yeah, the X-Men are going to be manipulated to make that particular amount of money. They're going to be expanded and extremely developed. They're going to have highs. They're going to have lows. They're going to have points where it's like really stale, and then it's going to be reinvigorated. But that is where your audience is at, and that means that's where your money is at. Now, with but the other stuff with Liefeld, man, unless you still want to do some more with the whole rebel aspect.
I would only say the only other point I would say that we can't really even address is the superstar status, because Byrne says some people have said I'm the first superstar, which he says was incorrect. So anything of him saying, Byrne saying he's the first superstar, is ridiculous because it's not understanding English. Byrne says some people said he was the first, but he says that's incorrect. So they're saying, no, Byrne, you're not the first one. There's other people. No, you're arguing. There's no point to argue. He's not saying he's the first. He's saying there's other people that were before him, and that could be Neil Adams. So we talked a little about it. The type of success is the type of success Rob has, where you can't really go anywhere. You still have that sort of thing. And at the same time, now the success Byrne has, when he goes to comic, then when people see him, they kind of like go crazy because they don't see him at cons. So it's a big deal, even though his sales aren't there. But, I just want to point out that is him talking about Byrne saying he was the first superstar. He's like, no, arguably, that's arguably, and saying he's not, is saying that, you take that and you understand the sentence, he's not saying he's the first superstar. So that's the other part that, like, he's got to
just
understand English.
Like, stop having an axe to grind and just be fair at the end of the day. Okay, because for me, Neil Adams is probably one of the most important, after Jack Kirby. Neil Adams is probably one of the most important artists in terms of comic book history. With after Jack Kirby. Okay, mm-hmm. I'm not disputing anybody like Schuster or Joe Simon or anything of that nature. Well, Joe Simon wasn't an artist, was he? I can't remember. Did Joe Simon draw it all?
Yeah, he did. They will.
Okay.
They'll take away from him, but he definitely drew. He definitely drew comics. And
yes, I'm not taking away anything from those guys, but without a doubt, Neil Adams was. If there was ever a rock star in comics, Neil Adams was that guy. However, okay, at the time, what was the platform for somebody like Neil Adams to be heralded like someone like John Byrne? You didn't have the cons, okay? You didn't have the access to these people. It's like today. There's no Twitter in 1966.
Mhm.
Okay, and in 1966, you didn't have the comic book platforms to come out. You didn't have the magazines, the trades. Like they would have like a like Variety magazine for comics. At that time, you had interest. Okay, but the platforms weren't there. So yeah, I mean, for Byrne coming out and he's like, yeah, I'm getting this type of recognition, where these guys are here. And Dick Giordano, I modeled myself after Dick Giordano. How am I getting more applause? Again, the,
Yeah.
these are the guys, he's probably looking, how am I getting? No, these guys over here, definitely, he understands where they are in terms of comic book history and what the reception should be. But the audience, okay, the audience for those guys might have been a generation or 10 years prior. These guys were in tune with what the books were, what the big books were at the time. And there was a platform for him to be the recipient, okay, of that adoration, if you will, from the stuff that he was doing at the point. That's all I took from it. Not that, hey, I'm the best thing since sliced bread. And look,
Yes.
these guys over here, these guys over here, look at these has-beens over here. I'm showing you how it's done. No, I never took that. I never took that from the article at all. And the fact that Liefeld takes that from the article, I don't know if it's just disingenuous or you have such an axe to grind that you refuse to allow proper reading comprehension to take over. Especially if you're going to do a podcast, especially if you're going to do a podcast on it, try to be as fair as possible. But there's maybe a couple of ways to read what Byrne said, and it's still not the way the Liefeld was taking it.
Mhm.
So it's one thing with his stuff that always does get me, because some points he's very lucid and he's very spot on. Like, okay, yeah, can definitely agree with that. And then the other stuff is like, oh no, we're down the Rob hole again. Let's see how long we're gonna be here. Okay, we're gonna be here a while. We're gonna be here a while.
So that's the getting to that when you bringing that up. The hardest thing is going to the actual thing that has been Burns' biggest issue is saying he said that I don't really have that most of my problems would stop with Image if Todd would just shut up. And one of the biggest things that which Rob brings up is Todd McFarlane saying, and we have to curse on Mars is going to be upset with me. Said anyone can shit out a monthly comic. We're growing roses here. This was either I will try to find. I found it recently. It's either in Wizard or his Heroes or the Fan, where Image was talking about changing their dynamic, getting books out on time, and firing anyone who was late. They were still late after that part, but he
Yes,
said
they were.
but he says, hey, anyone can shit out a monthly comic. We're growing roses here. And the Image guys have been like, Todd said that umpteen years ago. Why does Byrne keep saying that up? Look, nothing dies in comics. How many dumb things that Byrne said still get repeated? This is what
Yep.
the thing is. You can't escape your thing, and you haven't been like, hey, you know what? That was what's the name? What's the name? Byrne has been on interviews where he's been called to task for stuff he said, and they had him clarify what he said, but they still hold on to that stuff because, hey, this is what it is. It's on Wikipedia. With Todd, we're like, hey, no, we can't bring this up anymore because of what? You're saying, hey, we're late because we're the guys who establish Image, so we can be late. We're trying to grow roses here. We'll fire Jerry Ordway. We'll fire
We can be
Mike
late.
Grell. We'll fire who's that?
I said we can be late, and what's more, we're going to be late.
Yes, and that's one of the things that him like Byrne. There's a healthy negative reaction from your peers that Byrne, Perez, Miller, all those guys. One of the few peers that didn't get it is no. I think they like Simonson's stuff, but at the same time, he didn't have. So I don't think he got it like they did. But I think Archie Goodwin kind of helped him too. But he was able to do his kind of stylistic stuff on Manhunter and get awards. But then, of course, how comics work, he was almost forgotten in the 70s and remembered when he did Thor. And they're like, who is this guy? Where did he come from? But one of the things is they got, even in the 80s, I think Howard Chaykin said, he said something really harsh about Byrne, saying, with like superficial skills. And Byrne recently said, well, Howard is someone who came before me, and at some point at that point in my career, even though I was having the big success with Superman, So somewhat it was true. I was still trying to learn to draw. So it's kind of he's taking on his message board something that Chaikin has said and took it on the chin. At the same time, him and Chaikin have talked, and Chaikin turns to him and said, "No, it's not those other guys who ruin the industry. Byrne, it's you because you went to Wolverine and made him mean and nasty, and that's what everyone wants to do now." So it's kind of like, but it's kind of a take, like the way that they kind of they would take Marv
Yeah,
Wolfman
but that
used to take shots at George till George was like wowed him to they're like, George, you got to do the Titans. He's like, no, I want to do the Justice League. No, George. So yeah, they I mean they would get a lot of ribbing to get them to get better, and I don't think in looking at them they would think the Image guys outside of Jim Lee would start to learn to get better, and they were like, no, we're not going to become Byrne and lose our style. We're going to use the style that has been a success, and they've kept it. And I mean, it's worked for them, but it's a different type of thing where they used to, the pros used to get it, like Neil Adams destroying Frank Miller like umpteen times till he got into the business, and Frank Miller being like, hey, that's like I got a job, and he still brought me in and said you need to fix this. Like, no, they're going to publish it. They're already going to publish it. It's like, no, maybe next time you get it right, type of thing. Well, no, friend, Neil Adams told Miller to go back to Vermont. He asked him, where are you from? Yeah, you need to go back there and get like a regular job, like that sort of thing. And understanding that would make people stronger. Perez too.
if you can, yeah, if you can take it. I mean, I did a couple of interviews with Neil Adams, and the first interview I did with him, I quickly realized, man, I better not say anything stupid. This guy will be all over me.
Yes.
Real quick,
Yes.
real quick. He had
Yes.
that look in his eye, like he had that look in your eye, like your grandfather or your father, like, hey, are you an idiot? Because
Yes.
he's like, I was like, okay, I better bring my A game with this interview. So I can understand if you can actually take that sort of yeah. I mean, Neil Adams was a pretty straightforward guy, and if you could take that criticism, you would have definitely. Well, hey, I think it speaks for itself because you have Miller, you have Sienkiewicz, you have all those guys, who came up, getting criticism from Neil Adams, and we see the results. And Howard Chaykin is critical of his own stuff. I mean,
Yes.
Howard Chaykin is a guy, he does not like his work on Star Wars. You come over here and you got to get Howard Chaykin to sign Star Wars books. My goodness, it's like he barely puts a signature on there, and then he looks at you. You want me to sign this ass?
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
does not. But if you look at the work he did on Star Wars as opposed to the work he's done on other stuff, you have to admit the quality of the work on stuff like American Flag is much better than what he did on Star Wars. But I have to handicap that because I think they were working with images of what the characters were supposed to look like,
Mhm.
and you look at the way they drew someone like Chewbacca
Mhm.
when it looks like a totally different character, or Darth
Yeah.
Vader, the helmet looks totally different. And so
Yeah.
you're like, okay, these guys didn't really have images to work with, in terms of these characters. Like Luke's hair is much longer, all of this stuff at the end of the day. But if you look at the first 6 issues of Star Wars, which are supposed to adapt the movie, and you
Mhm.
look at the titles on them, like Darth Vader, Luke Skywalker versus Darth Vader. And if you were reading that comic as a kid, you would think, oh, they're fighting each other. And in
Yeah.
the movie, that never happens. That's just
Yeah.
the ships, battling at the end of the day. And it wasn't,
Uh-huh.
it wasn't a match. Darth Vader had 2 other ships with him. Han Solo comes and blows everybody away, at the last minute. So you have those type of things. You have those situations going on. So I try to handicap it with that. But again, somebody who could be critical of his own work as much as he would with Byrne. And then, how much can you fault Byrne at the end of the day? He goes and he does what he does with Wolverine. And he's like, yeah, everybody wants to do it. Well, that was Superman. Superman comes out. How many Superman clones? DC spent as much time selling Superman as they did suing people to tell them to cease and desist. you
Yeah.
know, I mean, like everybody hit. They were like, hey, what is it? Imitation is the biggest form of flattery. But at the same point, this is hidden. Hey, why don't we try? Why don't we try our own? That was one of the things I would say with like Fawcett Comics. Everybody knows the lawsuit with Fawcett Comics and Captain Marvel. Nobody knows about the lawsuit with Fawcett Comics and I think it was like the Bulleteer. They had some
Yeah.
character
Okay.
that came
Yeah.
out, and
Yeah.
as soon as that character came out, DC said, "Hell no, you better
Mhm.
stop that nonsense!" Right? And that one got shut down. So it wasn't that Fawcett hadn't tried. It wasn't that these guys didn't try at the end of the day, but it happens. And then you get someone like Lobo, and Lobo's supposed to be what? He's supposed to be a spoof or a parody of the Wolverine type character, and the fans love it. They love it at the end
Yes.
of the day. So what do you? So what's supposed to happen? These guys are into it. That's where that particular generation is at, and it's dudes as well. Okay, who doesn't want to be the tough, scrappy guy who can get knocked down and keep getting back up? They love that type of stuff at the end of the day. But that character Wolverine was exploited very well. If you did not have, it's one thing for what Byrne did on the X-Men book, but it was that for me it was that Wolverine limited series, because even guys who weren't reading those X-Men titles had read that Wolverine limited series,
Yeah.
and that's what really brought him over the top for me,
Yeah.
because that was 4 issues concentrated with him. And this is like, it was like a typical cowboy story at the end of the day, and it works. I mean, that's not a story you could ever do with Wolverine today, but that's a classic story right there. And between, you had Chris Claremont on the story, Frank Miller on the art. So all of those things within perspective of the history where it was where it was coming along. And then getting back with Rob again, the perspective, what was going on at the time, and the biggest criticism is, you guys are targeting speculators. Who's buying these books. It's not collectors or kids, coming over here saying, "Oh, hey, we like this stuff." You're targeting these dudes who think they're going to be able to turn Youngblood over for $1, and you knew they were not going to be able to turn that book over for $1, and you didn't care.
Well, that's the thing. When you go to the other part where the image guys not being rebels, the thing of it is, only person who owns up to it not being that big a deal of leaving Marvel and DC was that they're saying that Marvel and DC are, if they would have failed, Marvel and DC would have totally let all of those guys except for Jim Valentino back to the company.
Yep.
They would have not held back Silvestri. And obviously, no, Willis Portacio was a part of it, and he had I think Byrne pointed out the Death in the Family, something like that, and he went back to Marvel. Like, the thing of it is, and the thing of not being rebels is that not just Rob didn't leave Marvel and do Youngblood and say, like, the only one who wasn't working in comics was Todd McFarlane. Rob was like saying in interviews, "I'm doing Youngblood. I'm doing no, I'm doing X Force. I'm going to do a cable miniseries, and I'm going to do a creator-owned book." So that was his thing. So his plan was to keep all three going, like have the thing and have the X-Men. So it was going to co-sign. And even if, no, actually Marvel had no issue, because Marvel was told, when they had that big meeting, Todd was cursing them out and he didn't even work at them at that point. They were like, "Come back again. We'll talk. We'll, like, you get an Epic line. Let's talk about it. Let's figure it out." Like, I think it was Terry, even though I think Terry Stewart upset, I think Jim Lee talking about, "Hey, we won't get a flight, we won't fly your mother," or something like that. And Jim Lee responded back. They said, other people say they didn't end where they were just like, "F you, this, that, and the other." It was like, "Hey, you guys still aren't clear, because some of you guys are kind of talking about working with us. Some of you guys are obviously against it." So they had both who's it, Willis, Rob.
Wasn't didn't Jim Lee wasn't I think when Jim Lee was talking with Image, wasn't I forget if this is correct or not. Wasn't he the guy who was like, "Hey, if this doesn't work out, can we go back?"
Yeah, that's the thing. Even though he was worried about his, I think what Rob was saying, he was worried about his insurance type of deal. But ultimately, like, he just made like 8 million. Like, there's no way, if Byrne can come back and ultimately at some point they grab him and say, "Hey, you're working on three books now, three books now. Can you add Wolverine to the schedule?" And they're like, "Oh yeah, I can do Loose Breakdown. Like, I'm ending Star Brand. I think I could do Wolverine. Oh great, we don't have an artist for Wolverine. We don't." We don't have anyone to do Wolverine right now. We need John Buscema to do Marvel Comics Presents. Can you do it, John? Oh yeah, okay. Who's right? Oh, Archie, definitely. I'll find time, type of deal. Not that it's Wolverine. Like, whereas this is a big difference between if you turned to Rob Liefeld and said, "Hey, would you like to draw Wolverine?" He would have said yes immediately. Not, "Who's writing it?" I'll find like that's, but yeah, I think ultimately one of the things that Rob and Rob Willis, Jim Lee, they all said that they were going to do a independent book while they were on that, and then once they saw that there was a million sales and X-Men and Spider-Man, they're saying that Rob did that, oh, we're gonna blow him out the water. I did eight, like they all were basically, and Rob I think mentions that, so they kind of got rid of their mall, but like Rob was still foot in because he like his last issue of Youngblood, he did layouts and they were wondering if he was going to finish it, but he just did the layout, sent it to Mike Mignola. Mike Mignola was like, I was sending the cover, and then they were like, we don't want to use that cover. We want to use Rob's cover. And he's like, Rob has left you guys. He's not.
I mean,
coming back.
how out? My whole thing is Jim Lee, Rob Liefeld. How out were they? Because these guys were back in Marvel doing Heroes Reborn. Not that long after they wasn't that long before they were doing that. Before they were back at Marvel doing this. So Rob was kind of.
That's the thing.
Rob is like he's this guy who strikes me like you don't play well with others, do you?
Well, that's the other thing. I think it's either one of the interviews of Byrne. They said like Byrne was saying that they were going to go back to Marvel. I said, well, you were right. They did go back to Marvel, and he's like, yeah, like Marvel kind of brokered that deal. Like the money they were getting kind of went into the them going to the Sotheby's and going to the X summits and talking about Image at the same time. So it's on Marvel's dime. So it's like being a rebel while you're doing stuff similar and you making money using their money to subsidize your independent thing, which is not a bad thing, but let's just be honest about it. Let's not act like ultimately doing that. And I think what Byrne's initial issue, most the pros weren't because they were jealous. They were like, they're coming out and saying the thing that Byrne had been complaining about for years, when people saying, I can't do my best creations because Marvel owns them, so I had to hold back. And then once he heard that, I think all bets were off. He was like, because listen, Jim Lee had asked Byrne to come with him because they were working on the X-Men together, and he's like saying, hey, you want to join us? They say that he was only going to do he was going to do a work for hire thing, but I don't believe Jim Lee had presented it like that. And Byrne said, no, I've already set up at Dark Horse. And Jim Lee's like, oh, you can just take that stuff and put it at Image. He's like, no, already set up, so I'm not gonna leave. And then, but ultimately, that's the part that's crazy, because they started saying stuff in the press, saying that they were being held back, and now they're gonna be able to do the creations that that they were scared Marvel was gonna own forever. And then they were like, well, why are you guys even in it? And Peter David took the same issue with them, saying, hey, if you were holding back, you're like, you could just go somewhere else. There was independent stuff out there for you. You could go do it and own your own stuff. It was already there. But they were like, it's so. And then that's the only time I think Byrne and Peter David agreed. Which Image guys, look, they became an alliance. They're an alliance at us. They're behind the scenes trying to plot against us. And that's what I think Todd was trying to get out of the debate with Peter David, that Byrne and David were aligned together trying to take down Image in the press, when Byrne just agreed with one of the few things that Byrne agreed with Peter David. So, but yeah, I think ultimately the biggest issue, the stuff they were saying, the bad publishing thing, because ultimately that was the proof of a good selling book. Like, it's the hard part to look at DC in the 70s. There were a lot of books that were 6 issues a year, like stuff like Superboy, the New Gods, and Marvel stuff are mostly all of their top titles are monthly. So I don't know if DC struggled or Kirby struggles because it was on a 6 times a year schedule, even though they had other Kirby books at the same time. I'm not sure if I think Jimmy Olsen was a bi-monthly thing, but it was kind of, there was a stretched out schedule where Marvel was always that. And Marvel in the 80s and DC, they all had gotten their stuff pretty much on time. There was stuff that was late, and if you had a late book, it usually killed the book. Like, you had something that shipped late and had a lot of fill-ins, the book would die. And Image took that model and threw it out. And they're just like, no, like the fans, you're selling to retailers and you don't ship Youngblood, and the retailers are like, hey, we'll get returns. We don't have to buy anything next. We're gonna, because I don't want to buy Next Men. I don't want to buy Nexus. I don't want to buy, whatever else, was out there, because they're waiting for the Rob or the Todd book. And that's the thing that they were kind of calling Image to task, because they were taking up shelf space for books that weren't there. And that's why there was no reason for them to ever stop complaining, because it was the whole thing to the bust of them taking shelf space and not producing comic books. Well, books, not just Byrne books, any books that you think that could have made it, like books that I like from the Legend guys, and saying, hey, maybe we buy more of that, since we know that Youngblood isn't out. It's on 3 times a year, or it's a 6 times a year type of deal. That's the hard part that they miss, is that he would call them the task for the stuff they were saying, bad publishing, and kind of buying out any new talent that came out there. They could have bought out any of the monthly guys that work for Marvel, but they were like, who's the new hot guy? And then they become late artists, and they weren't becoming these guys that would, enrich the he has inkers, Danny Miki, a bunch of guys that have gone on to good careers outside of comics too. But the fact is that this Image explosion kind of stunted comics growth, even though they gave them better paper. The better paper all in color kind of ruined the price. So it took it out of the thing where kids could get it. And the hard time, you look at the store behind me, you bring a kid to that and they don't even know what to see. They look at it and it's just like, it's a causing blur to the kids now. And it really hurts me to see that, where, I would go in the comic book store. I still go into one like this and just like, oh my God. All right, I spent that the last time I went to a comic book store on my birthday. Good Lord, I spent so much money. So anyway, but yeah, I think those are the 3 things Byrne with the task, and he's not going to really forgive him for it, because they've changed the narrative. That Image broke off, gave opportunities, and then it won in the end because they had the Walking Dead. That's the narrative, and it's like it's totally how it helped. It wasn't the side, because Marvel very, very much had a part in messing up the market, but Image also had a part too. DC to a lesser extent, because they would do the practices, but they were still just trying to do monthly stuff. They just, as you and Rob would say, they just enjoy being number 2. But I don't think they did as only following suit and going to Diamond and getting out the newsstand, when maybe they should have just stayed in the newsstand and not bolted, and they would still have that shelf space. So, well, at least for a little while, because I know nowadays the shelf space is probably too much for Marvel. DC would probably had to left, but they would have had a few years of staying on the shelf, and Marvel's like, we want to get back. We want to get back. So following Marvel is one of their big mistakes. But yeah, I think those 3 things are the big things that Byrne has issue with, and there's no reason to not, because everyone's forgot it. Everyone's like, these guys did great. They made millionaires out of everybody. It was a brand new age. But
yeah, and it was all based on speculating that the age was. It was speculation on what the age was, and a lot of guys read it incorrectly. Unfortunately, hey, there is a. I mean, I sell comics. There is a reason why a certain period of the '90s, actually, not even a certain period of the '90s, are looked upon as the worst period for comics of all time. It's a remarkable premise, since that's where a lot of guys came in. A lot of the guys who are still reading are guys who came in at that time. And again, I always lay it at the feet of the readership, because they're giving you what it is that you want. And everybody was with it. Everybody was making money hand over fist.
yeah.
And then when it all stopped, it became, oh, these books are junk. I was like, yeah, but you guys are buying them.
Even the books that are gorgeous, they haven't made their way to like superstar status yet. That's the hard part. It's like, but yeah, it's the hard with Marvel, it's like now looking at the 90s and looking at books like the X-Men, they all cost like either between 10 cents or more, different price tag on the regular newsstand comic books. It really pains me that Spider-Man, X-Men, all the X books were 10 cents more or 25 cents more. They had all these weird practices that didn't even sustain the lower selling books. They would still look at it as this is no good. They were just finding ways to make money. And then you had the image guys that, follow the suit of what Marvel did, which is what all the pros, and I think Frank Miller agreed for years that image guys wanted to be Marvel in the worst way, and took until they did Heroes Return. No, Heroes Reborn, where Frank Miller finally agreed that these guys were in it for the money. And then, of course, what did they do? They just turned on Frank. They turned it into Byrne, blah, 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 blah. Then it turned to Byrne and Miller, blah, blah. Like, he was your biggest supporter. He defended you, and he said one thing negative to say about you. You threw him right on the same shelf as Byrne. Like, with these guys complaining while we're out there helping, we got money, we went back to Marvel, we helped Kirby out. It's in our contract. You didn't see it, but it is. It's just like,
So
no.
they all wanted. I don't know if they wanted. They wanted Marvel money. I don't know if there's so much they wanted to like espouse the creativity that started the Marvel universe, 61 to 64, if you will.
Mhm.
But they definitely wanted that Marvel money because that's what jump started these guys. Hey, look at these guys. They're selling T-shirts. They're getting all these royalties. Mind you, it wasn't like they weren't getting paid, and it wasn't like they weren't getting paid very, very well. But they were like, hey, there's more money to be made, and that was the jump start for Image more than anything else. And then you have to look now, and Rob and Jim Lee already went back. They did a stint, they did a stint at Marvel, but Jim Lee's firmly with DC now.
Yes.
Yeah, he's firmly with DC. He does his commissions. He does art for DC on whatever books that they ask him to do or that he wants to do. Todd McFarlane is working with DC in terms of producing toys. He just did Batman. He just did Batman Spawn again. With these guys. I guess the great irony is that for people who wanted to be like Marvel, they've had more success working with DC than anything at that point. Even though I understand from what I understand, Todd McFarlane is not going to do anything at Marvel Comics unless it's Spider-Man, and he's not doing anything Spider-Man at Marvel Comics unless he gets to make toys. So that's not going to happen.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I give, because I think Rob also, and I'm saying there's a side of it that is definitely entertaining, but I think it's from what you said, it's more Rob's observation of kind of Rob's opinion, even if he has the same articles that I have, but they somehow come in a different slant. There's no point where he reads the thing and says, hey, Byrne complimented him here, then he's upset with him later. Like, that could be easily put in there, but he discounts it, and that's on the side of, if you say there's a lot of podcasts, and I'm saying we're podcasts. I think when you see our pieces where we try to do as much research as possible, you can look at it as journalism, but otherwise it's a blog. So I'm saying you take us as far as our opinion, you can definitely take his stuff from opinion, but it's definitely entertaining. He does have information. And that's the hard thing. If you could look at Jim Shooter's blog, because I sent it to a friend of mine because I was joking, because he said there's a cover of Miles Morales in the darkest Spider-Man outfit, and his Ultimate Spider-Man #1 with Miles Morales on the cover, and he's swinging in the city. And I sent it to a friend and said, what's wrong with this cover? And they're thinking I'm going to be the one because I'm so tough on comics and obviously Bendis and Miles Morales. But it was a Jim Shooter blog, and it's a gorgeous cover. He just tore it apart. He complained about John Romita at the same time. John Romita, was wrong all those times, being the look of Spider-Man. That was wrong. It should have been Ditko's version of it. It's just like, good, make them stop. Make them stop. But it's like, these things are opinions, and a lot of times we kind of go with the opinions. But I believe, Cal and Mars are pretty good historians on other things outside of comics and in comics. I think you do your history by looking at everything and not just taking Rob's word for at face value, because you have to read it yourself and you have to look. There is, because I think he always brings up that Byrne got everyone upset in a Comics Journal article where he joked about different things. He did joke about one thing when he joked about how George Perez's character interacted. It wasn't something that became him a beef between him and George Perez because they've been friends whenever they met up. There's a different article. There's an article where Byrne was critical of Roy Thomas and Gene Colan, which is Gene Colan stuff. He was right about the flaws in the artwork, but it just harsh because it was that kind of criticism that that the comic pros do, which ultimately he had to pull back from, even though Comics Journal pointed a picture showing the flaws in the Gene Colan drawing. I think the Roy Thomas thing was a little too rough. It shouldn't have been as harsh, even though he was trying
It
to get.
was
Hmm?
it was unnecessary
Yeah,
to
yeah.
that type of stuff is I remember this guy took J. Scott Campbell to task for his work. So
Hmm.
J. Scott Campbell decided he was going to critique
Oh
the
yeah,
guy who critiqued him.
yes,
He was
yeah.
and Jace, I mean, he eviscerated the dude's artwork, but you know, at the end of the day, it's art. You can find a lot of fault with a whole bunch of this stuff.
Hmm.
It's and for me, it's easy because it's art. It's not real. It's not real at the end of the day. It's very easy to find fault with something that is supposed to evoke something that's real, and it's not, and it's not. So
Hmm.
there's always going to be something there. Even the best rendered piece of art is something that you could probably find some sort of fault with. But then to emphasize and accentuate the whole thing, especially when if it's somebody like Gene Colan, who's a proven artist, for decades over a myriad amount of books, and had was definitely pleasing to the eye in terms of his action sequences and his storytelling. To do that sort of stuff at that point, it's like, yeah, that was just
Yeah,
unnecessary.
but
I'm
that's
very certain that Colan had his style. It wasn't going to change based on anything Byrne said.
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
it was
Well,
it was
that's
just unnecessary.
exactly. I'm not. That's the thing. You can, but I would not. He's trying to bring up beef between, like, him saying some, a couple gags about things in comparison to the real stuff, which is what you can call people to task, and they've already dealt with that sort of thing. So the hard part is like, I think you can look at this stuff. The comic history is something that is kind of a lost thing, and that's what I think the hard part of Robservations is, that knowing that it's lost, he comes in and then he's like, I'm going to fill the gaps and I have the stuff. But he has a slant to his reading and he has a hard time kind of understanding what is a gag and what is the true thing. Now, if you want to go to task and you want to go pull out all of the bad quotes Byrne did, there's nothing I can do. As much of a fan as I am, it is what it is. So, you can call on task for that. But when you do a Rob versus Byrne, you say Byrne is a fan of his stuff. He complimented his stuff. He said, what I asked him, what artist does he like? He said, oh, I like Todd McFarlane. He said at some points that he has a great design sense. And then at some point, then when the image stuff happens, they have this thing where there's a back and forth. But they were on panels together. Their stuff didn't. The same time Byrne is on the panel, and then he does his blog. He's not holding back from what he feels. He's doing stuff that's jokes. Is like saying, "Hey, this, that, and the other." I still don't want to do Next Men, Young Blood crossover type of deal. Whereas him and Rob had called him a bunch of times. Rob would say he avoided him at some point. They said they talked about a couple things, and he asked him to do Young Blood. He asked him to do Supreme. He asked him to do which Byrne was like, I would create my own Superman clone. But he asked him to do Supreme, and I think that Byrne said he asked him to do Next Men Young Blood type of thing. But it's one of those things. I guess. And any other things you want to say? I think we tried to say you can still enjoy it, but what do you say?
Without a doubt, I mean, we wouldn't listen to it if it wasn't enjoyable for
Mm-hmm.
a myriad amount of reasons. From from the good points that Rob Liefeld does make, because he does genuinely love comics. Do I believe he's making a comic every day? No, I do not. But he does genuinely he does genuinely love comics, and he can be. And I've told you this. He can be very lucid when it comes to some of these points, but it a large amount of it feels like he still has an axe to grind with these dudes. And I don't even know if I'm pretty certain if he went to John Byrne, say, "Hey, John Byrne, what about this thing with you and Rob Liefeld?" Like, who? What? I
Well, that
don't think he's.
yes,
I
yes.
don't think. I don't even think Todd McFarlane would be there at the end of the day, because they. It would be hard for me to imagine that Todd McFarlane has. I mean, he may not have any love laws for John Byrne at this point, but to still have any edge towards him at this point with all the stuff that Todd McFarlane has going for him, I just it would be really hard for me to imagine it. Meaning, it would be hard for me to imagine Todd McFarlane doing a podcast like this. It would not be worth. It would just not be worth his time. And Liefeld, unfortunately, is not focused. This isn't a rivalry so much as it seems to just be beef. And it's not. If he stuck to the history, I think that would be much more in his lane, because he's very lucid when he does that. And that's the height of the entertainment for these particular podcasts. When, like I said, when it's an observation from Rob Liefeld, I think it can be very spot on, if not spot on, period. And when it's a Robservation, like we don't know how deep the rabbit hole will go. And a lot of times it goes very, very deep. But he, like I said, he was spot on with the stuff about Siegel and Schuster. There's just no way. There's just no way you can't look at the originators of the genre, or subgenre, if you will, as anything less than rebels, because of what was going on at the point. And then, to say that they were following a trend, no, like, it was very clear that these guys were doing these books. They ran out of reprints. It was like, we need new material. What do we got in here? They had the Superman stuff in a drawer. They had already passed on it. I think they had passed on it twice already. And here's the thing: they said no to Superman, but they said yes to Dr. Occult. They said yes to Slam Bradley.
Yes, yeah, yes, yep,
Nobody
yep,
knows who these
yes,
guys are.
yes. There you go. Yes,
Nobody knows who these
that's
characters
very
are. This is,
important.
everybody, hey, what about, that character that Siegel and Schuster created, Slam Bradley? What about that? Who? They have no idea who these people are. Most people don't even know that Zatara, the magician, his first appearance is in Action Comics 1 as well. Nobody knows. Probably don't care. They don't care either. Okay.
Yeah,
So it was, again, this was just to the point, like, hey, we need something in here. This is ready to go. Let's put it in here. And and everybody was off to the races. And even Siegel and Schuster, as I've said before, they were really pleased with the effect of what Superman did in the comic, because that was going to get them the news strip. That's where they
yeah,
were still
yeah.
at. And most people have never read the news strip, which is some really good stuff. It's probably some of Schuster's better artwork. If you look at the origin of Superman as from the news strip,
Yes,
where
yeah,
it's like
yeah,
really fleshed out,
yeah, yeah.
it's, I mean, the quality on that is really good. And I don't want to get ahead of myself, because I know he had I don't know if the stuff that I'm looking at is when he had his studio up and running, because I know his eyesight wasn't top after a certain point. But you look at the stuff they were doing in the news strip, really, really nice stuff in those dailies. So Rob is spot on with that. Okay, Stan and Jack, yeah, spot on. You can't call them anything less than that. So I would totally disagree if anybody would come and say that they weren't, rebels, of the genre that they were in, because they could have just went along, and we would have never got any of the stuff that we have right now. There was a bit of luck in there as well. And but without a doubt, taking a risk, okay, because that's how we got the thing. That's how we got the things that we have. But the other portion of, oh, he's taking shots, he's taking shots he's taking shots at Todd McFarlane. After a while, it becomes very overweening and really supercilious in terms of how sensitive he's being about everything that John Byrne would have to say. It just doesn't make a lot of sense, and then it does come across as an axe to grind. So yeah, when he's about the history, spot on, because there's a lot of great history. There's a lot of great history from that time period that he can speak to directly. Okay, but the stuff with the rivalries might be something that he should just stay away from if you're still that emotionally attached to it.
Yeah, that's the hard part of having I don't know. It's as tough as Byrne has been on the comic industry, like you hear going to cons and run, like Byrne running into Warren Ellis and some kid like begging Warren Ellis to say a curse word. And he's like, no, I'm not doing it on demand. And Byrne just walks into us like, hey, say that, say that word. And he says it for Byrne. The fan is like, oh, like just having fun in the comic thing, whereas you might be on opposite sides of a fence and then like saying, hey, it's not really that big of a deal. And so side note, I will go to Simon and Kirby, you don't have to call them rebels. They were just the proven name in the comic industry. They were the bankable name that you could. Simon and Kirby. They did Cap. They did that. They created, but they were already a bankable name that you knew at some point they were going to do something that hit. So not necessarily, they didn't have to be rebels because they were just that look that you would like. Yes, these guys, they did Cap. They went and did like a they turned Sandman into a Batman clone where it's like Batman, Sandman, and Sandy, and it's like, but that was their big success that no one will know. People say, well, it would be romance, but yeah, they turned, because there was already Archie out, but having the adult sort of romance sort of thing. But that's but they were just the bankable name, and it was a bankable name all through the 40s, and a little bit of struggle in the 50s up until they broke up. But yes, like it's the different. You can't always understand what the idea of what Byrne was trying to say. Like you can't always just throw people in the rebel category, but you have to throw Siegel and Schuster in there. I mean, like you can't be you can't be turned down that many times and not be.
Well, if you're gonna throw an ElfQuest.
No, yeah. If you're gonna go for Elf, because you got to go for someone who's all the people, the first guys who did it, who are trying there and taking taking, like even DC was saying it was ridiculous. They said, I think there's a quote saying it was ridiculous. So looking at the cover, they said the guy looked at the cover and said this is ridiculous. And then of course, and they also they would like when they said Siegel asked for a little bit more money, say, hey, this Superman is not like, he's like 30% of the book. There's no chance. Not even like Mickey Mouse isn't, like they're not even, I think it was Popeye isn't even holding his own book by himself. Your Superman character is okay. Here's Superman #1. They later do stats, so it's like you have something where people said no and they said yes, and then even when they said yes, they were still like, nah, it's not going to be it, and it became the industry. So
that's been DC. That's been DC since that's been DC's approach with Superman. DC's approach with Superman has been schizophrenic from the beginning, because it's like, hey, this guy, that was the reason why they kept getting turned down, because they present Superman and they're like, this is just too wild a concept for people to grasp, and they're like, no, we don't see it, it's not going anywhere, we're not doing anything with it. And then when it sells, they always seem to sell Superman like, we better maximize the money we can make on this character before the audience just dries up and doesn't want him anymore, because this character is just too wild at the end of the day. 80 some odd years later, they still treat the character the same way. We better get as much money out of this character before these guys wake up and realize this is a dude coming from a different planet who could do anything. Oh no, it'll never sell. But the approach is very much the same today, where the investment in Superman, regardless, regardless of how much he took on his shoulders as a character, and without a doubt, that is the company that Superman built, without a doubt. Regardless of how much he took on his shoulders, they're always like hedging their bet, like, we don't know. This guy over here is just too wild of a concept. Hey, but that dude with the bat costume with the money, there we go.
Well,
it's amazing.
To end, there's also, I guess at some point I was talking with the guys that talk about the Peter David and what's the name, and Todd McFarlane debate, because I think Rob had done it and he kind of turned Perez into like a guy who's on Peter David's side, when Perez was like, this is going to be a debate, because I think Don Thompson from the Comics Buyer guys were going to do it, but he bowed out. And Perez is just like, at the same time, he's a fun, exciting guy. When it comes to business, he's he was as rigid as Byrne. Says, I'm going to be a moderator. We're not going to have any hijinks. we're gonna have a debate, and that's when it was over for Todd McFarlane because he couldn't just be like cheer the fans on. He's like, you answer this. It wasn't a slanted, even though there's a drawing where you had the Hulk punching Spawn into the thing. That didn't mean that Perez was on Peter David's side. He just did.
No, it just meant Todd McFarlane. Oh, good grief! That would have been like me stepping into the ring with like Floyd Mayweather or something. At the end of the day, he was stepping into the ring with Peter David for an actual debate, and this is Peter David. If you read the stuff and had any conversation with Peter David, yes, Peter David is a real sharp as a tack guy
Yes,
who probably has a myriad amount of intellectual interests,
yes.
and so he would have been able to maintain himself in the debate. Todd McFarlane came there and took his shirt off. Obviously, he was not thinking of it the same way. So and there you go. But that again, great history. That again is great history, and it's really cool to hear it from somebody who was there, or even from guys like us talking about it. Because a lot of the stuff that we got, we had to read it. You had to go to Comic Journal, Amazing Heroes. You had to go read these trades in order to get a lot of this information, because it wasn't just being furnished.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and you could pick up stuff here and there, and nobody read all of it, because there's still stuff now I'm finding out about. It's one of the reasons I'm a lot more easygoing when it comes to comics, when I understand, okay, well, this is the business aspect of it, and this is what I want as a reader. This is what these guys are doing. Like, one of the biggest things, when Christopher Priest was on Black Panther,
Mm-hmm.
I at one point I was ready to drop the book because I was livid. I thought what he was doing was really insulting to the character,
Mm-hmm.
and I was like, why is this guy writing like this? Then I caught an interview with him, and his understanding, at least of his approach to the book, was he thought the book was going to be canceled after 1 year. So he had an artist for like about 5 or 6 issues, and he tried to write the book to the strength of that artist. That artist shifted. Then I think they had almost like a different artist after
Yeah.
issue 7. They had a
Yes.
different artist for like 4 issues. And so his approach again was like, all right, this book is going to be canceled. So, he was trying to write it to the strength of one artist. That guy was gone. New guy would come on. The next thing you know, he's drawing like a more of a comic, a comic-y type story. But his art isn't necessarily lending to that at the end of the day. Where, I think at one point Black Panther was inside of a giant gumball machine, and that would have worked for that guy's art because he was drawing a little bit more like Bruce Timm,
Mm-hmm.
and the other guy was drawing more photorealistic. So it was all over the place for me. And then there was some other stories that I was just like, this is kind of dumb. But Christopher Priest was like, he wrote the 12th issue and he was done.
Mm-hmm.
And he's doing something or other, and then he gets like a phone call or an email, and he's like, hey, where's issue 13? He's like, what do you mean, it's not canceled? And he's like, oh, so he's got to get a story out. So he gets this story out, he gets that story out, and he keeps expecting this book is canceled, and it's not canceled month after month. And so then he finally settles in and says, okay, let me just write the book instead of me just turning out these stories thinking that this is the last month, and just write it. And after that we get 40. We after that period, I think this is pretty much from issue 12 through about issue 19,
Mm-hmm.
where if you read the stories, it's just kind of like, what the hell is going on here? So, but after that period, you get a really strong run of writing. But otherwise, if I hadn't have read that, okay, I would have had this chip on my shoulder regarding what's going on, behind, what's going on with the book, in terms of being a reader, but not understanding what was going on behind the scenes and what was the approach to what was going on. It's like, oh, okay. Doesn't mean I necessarily, liked it anymore, but I could understand what was going on. And it made perfect sense once I had that particular information. That's something I think that Robservations is very good for, understanding those particular dynamics. If you are someone who's really into comics more than just the reading, where like, the functional dynamics of what's going on behind the scenes, how these things are made, little tidbits, what was the gestation of some really good ideas that got onto the paper that we got to consume as readers. That type of stuff I'm all for. And I think he's good for that when he's lucid, so long as he's lucid.
Yeah. So this one there's so many aspects to cover. So this one obviously went very long because it was an hour. So we kind of compete. It was about the same amount of time as the Robservations, but I think it was kind of tough because it took so long for it to get to get to the actual beef, but it was more, as you said early on, that was like, what did Byrne say about us as image guys? Not really the beef between him and Todd, but Todd was the ringleader. He was always saw as Todd and his friends, which it actually wasn't that. You had Jim Lee, you had all these other things, Rob, who had the biggest portion of the image books, and then you had what was it? Then you had who's it? Jim? No, sorry, Silvestri and Eric Larson had a line of stuff, but those books didn't really sell. Even though those ones, I think I bought as much as I did the Jim Lee stuff, Super Patriot and all that. But yeah, anyway, so yeah, there's other stuff to talk about this. We kind of go in behind the scenes and like, what did he just say type of deal. But yeah, definitely there's something there to listen to. And it's,
Well,
with any, huh?
no, to chime in, I mean, of that Magnificent Seven crew that came out and was in Image Comics, if you had to, when you say Image Comics today, of that Magnificent Seven crew, whose name jumps to your mind?
Sheesh, it's McFarlane and Lee. Those are the
Yeah,
two guys. Yeah,
that's pretty much. I mean, for me, at this point, I mean, at that point, it because Spawn was the book that really brought me in. I wasn't reading the other stuff too tough. And even today, it's going to be McFarlane, but Todd was, I mean, he was already doing so well on the Spider-Man stuff. So I think he had of all of them, in terms of visibility, I think he might have had the highest profile and was the most voluble of everybody there. And he's the last man standing. So
yeah,
if we look at it today, I mean, Eric Larson is still there, but that's another episode. That's another episode.
yeah.
And people would then I would turn into Rob Liefeld for that episode. It would be nothing. It would be nothing but me taking jokes at his expense. So I won't do that. But he's the last man standing. So for better for worse, Todd McFarlane has been and still is the face of Image Comics. Even from back then, you still had Jim Lee. I mean, and everybody knows what a powerhouse Jim Lee is in terms of his art. But Todd McFarlane was the face of the comic. He already had a high profile coming over. He was probably the most outspoken. So you can understand if guys would have taken some more. Guys would have directed their stuff at him as opposed to Image proper. But they considered Todd Image proper. But and the other thing, and I thought you made a really good point, is that is part of the business where these guys will come over here and take some criticism. They will. People think of it as taking shots, but he's being critical, and a lot of that was coming from a system where that criticism was supposed to make you better in terms of what you were doing. And the New Jacks, the Image dudes, were like, "No, we don't see it that way at all. You guys are just taking shots because we're selling millions. We're selling millions of copies better than you."
Yeah. Well, ultimately, well, the last thing is this things where he brings up stuff like J. Scott Campbell, which you mentioned before, and J. Scott Campbell had two hits, which was Gen 13 and Danger Girl, and I think the problem with both of those titles was that first off, Gen 13 didn't keep the same artist for a decent amount of time to make it last when it got to another artist. They had Gary Frank, who's still hot now, doing Gen 13. But when you look at it, they don't give the scripter slash co-writer any credit. Like Brandon Choi, who always gets treated terribly because he was the scripter on the co-writer on Jim Lee's books, had the one actual readable hit in Gen 13. I think it's Andy Hartnett who co-wrote Danger Girl. If you read the thing, these are readable Image books, which is hard to do outside of the stuff. Who's that guy? Outside of Alan Moore, which of course it's in Alan Moore style. It's obviously going to be it's like you can sit. My thing of reading comics was going back as a kid, take my socks off and reading the books on the floor, trying to read the dialogue and this sort of thing. So those are readable stuff. But there's a lot of books that weren't readable, and the couple of hits they had that were readable, they don't even give the scripter co-writers any credit. He's like, what's the name? Yes, the sales of what's the name, but you had a readable Image book that's saying this is what it is. This is a hot book, fun, connects to the kids, has some Archie aspects to it, but it has some hot Jim Lee, Arthur Adams type of thing, and the dialogue is fun. right? It's a fun like thing of a 20-minute read. The 20 Image Comics 15-minute read, right? So or less than that, 10-minute, but it's at least more something like that. Give your books and your creators the credit, Rob. Give these writers that scripted the book. Stop holding back on I know you got issues with Fabian Nicieza, but
He's giving them credit. Absolutely no credit.
it's like you gotta say the other guy's name because this fleshes the comic book out. I don't care you feel they did nothing. It's an important part of the book, and that's why the Gen 13 worked. Because yes, he's a hot artist. He's a hot artist on both of those books, but at the same time, the Wildsiders didn't do much of anything anyway. You got and the little bit of success that Image has outside of Walking Dead, you got to support that these guys from. But no, there's still hey, no, that book only sold because it's J. Scott's Camp. We didn't even know who he was. He did some cool covers. There's a bunch of Image guys that they had that did cool covers. And the Super Patriot has one of the best cover artists ever. Dave Johnson does gorgeous book. Both miniseries are great. Didn't sell anything. So much so that what's the name did this? What's the name? Red Sun, and never drew a full comic after that. Never. So it's like you can have great talent. The fact that you can lighten in the bottle, which I did 2 episodes on. I mean, that's the thing. So support the co-writers on there. Rob, talk about the thing that he don't see them adding anything. So I guess that's where I'm going to end it. You don't see them adding not a lick to it. Just somebody who filled in the balloon. So that's it. I'm going to close out because I keep going for another 2 hours. Sorry.
Yeah, easily. I mean, this is almost as bad as us doing Stan and Jack. Hey, if you want the real comic history, and if you want it from the experts, you know where to get it. The Spinner Rack. All right, Sam and Cal. That's where you guys come to get the real. Okay, you're driving in your car. You're pumping this. You're getting all of your information. You get to hear us go on these wild tangents and bring it back. It's all good.
He's gonna say we're a-holes. Look at us. We said we're better historians than he is. You don't understand Rob speak, man. We just screwed it for us. We patted ourselves on the back because we're better historians.
Oh man, I hope not, because we can't afford to go viral right now. We still have day jobs. No. No. Just wait a little bit longer. Then we can take all the stuff that comes with it. Right now, we can't do it. We're okay. Rob is better.
If Rob gets that far into this interview and finds out in the taxi, because he tagged me once. I don't want. It's so far. There's no one listens that long to our stuff. There's no way we can get caught this time. Spin a rack out.